Well, thank you, Shadow Minister. I think you've covered quite a substantial range of issues in your contribution, and I think there were some points that our audience would like to explore further with you. Look, we do have some microphones that can be passed to anybody who has a question, so please don't be afraid, put your hand up. I always say at CEDA forums, you get a chance, you've got a captive audience of one here, in this case, and someone who clearly has a point to make about policy, and so please enter into that debate. Here we go, over here. Thank you.
Hello, it's Ruth Schubert from, can you hear me? Yep, Ruth Schubert from University of Melbourne. Thank you for your presentation. You made a lot of fabulous points. One of the things I want to take up is the issue about STEM versus STEAM or STEAM. And I am really concerned that the issue of creativity that the arts bring is not being addressed. And also the question of entrepreneurial thinking, which is also really critical in this kind of artisan advanced manufacturing world that we're entering. Can you comment on that? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's very important. Don't interpret anything that I've said about the need to boost the number of STEM qualified individuals to mean that we don't need to add an A into that, and we do need to foster and grow our arts qualifications. I've got one myself. So a friend of mine who actually adds P and D to that as well and calls it STEMpede. Can't remember what the P or the D stand for, but yeah, it is not a solution in and of itself. But there is a trend happening here, and we've got to make sure that we boost the number of those skills that exist in our economy. Driving that entrepreneurial thinking, I think, is even harder. It's not something that you can simply learn. There's a cultural element here as well. It's perhaps the hardest challenge of all of the big and different things we need to do to make our economy more globally competitive. The US has the same problem as well. What you find in Silicon Valley, you don't find in many other parts of the United States as well. But we need to create a culture, I think, where instead of students going to university and wanting to work for a big company, students going to university and wanting to create a big company. And part of that is leadership from this building, from businesses, and it's also kids growing up knowing the names of famous entrepreneurs and wanting to emulate them. Elon Musk is a name on the tip of the tongue of a lot of kids in the Valley. You mentioned that name in Australia, and not so many people will have heard about it. Some of the policies that we put together in the election campaign were designed to target that, including a sort of a postgraduate entrepreneurial year where we would provide HECS-based funding to help support students after they've finished their undergraduate degree for some of the product development work that they would do in innovation hubs in universities. But that's just part of the solution.
Thank you.
Lionel Henderson, Director of Business Development and Commercial with CSIRO. I grapple on a daily basis with turning proof of concept into proof of product and getting over that gap of commercialisation that you mentioned in your speech. Has the opposition looked at any mechanisms by which it could free up or incentivise the release of funds, say, out of a small proportion of superannuation in a way that would allow that money to be utilised to retain ownership of the technologies within Australia, as opposed to us needing to go to attract, say, venture capital funding from the US or from other places? And, you know, the venture capitalists aren't in it from a philanthropic perspective. They're in it to make money. It's eventually is not a risk issue for some of those funding sources.
Yeah. Well, I think this is one of the big untapped opportunities in Australia, and it's not for want of trying. People have been looking at the availability of more than $1 trillion in superannuation funds to fund everything from big infrastructure through to the things that we're talking about today. In the course of the election campaign, what we said is the best way to address this is to get all of the stakeholders that work in this space together, whether it's private equity or whether it's major superannuation funds, and work with government to try to identify what's the best way to tap this potential resource. It's not easy. I don't think that we're going to necessarily solve this overnight. but it is something that I'm just as focused on because it's a major problem for Australia. And you would see it at CSIRO. I mentioned in my remarks that compared to other countries, Australia does not do very well when it comes to commercialising good ideas. And there's a reason for that. The nature of our economy means that a lot of the major companies that do this have their shop fronts in Australia, but not their big R&D in Australia. A lot of the big R&D is done by our universities or by the CSIRO. But that doesn't mean that this should be impossible or that we can't improve it, and superannuation might be one way to do that.
I have a question if nobody else does. Shadow Minister, I think you talked about creeping protectionism is a symptom of falling living standards and increasing inequality. I would add to that security concerns. If we are talking about, as we are at CEDA, at looking at the benefits that come through embracing digital disruption and the fourth industrial revolution, where do the leaders of Australia need to play to take people with them? Very quickly, I gave an address to a group of university people up in Brisbane on Friday. And that same week there was the latest edition of The Economist has a full spread about globalisation and the benefits of it. But as I said up there, the punters that live at the back of Longreach don't get The Economist and read it. Where is the leadership of this country needing to be to embrace all of those benefits, whilst at the same time, as you pointed out, ensuring that the less well-off are brought along as well?
Well, for a lot of people, this is scary. It's not exciting. You know, people are worried that this new world that we're talking about doesn't have a place for them. It's why people, you know, in all of the polling that you see, say this is not something that drives them to vote for the government or vote for the opposition. A lot of people are terrified about it. But just like, you know, you can make the comparison between this and between the reforms of the 80s or the 90s. And let me point particularly to trade. Trade and trade reforms, cutting tariffs, big trade deals have never been popular. When Keating and Hawke cut tariffs in the 1980s, they didn't win any jump in the polls because of that. But they were big and they were important. They transformed the country. And what Keating and Hawke, I think, understood is that with any of these reforms, there will be winners and losers. And for the people that lose out, you can't just leave them on the sideline. You've got to help them, whether it's changing their skills to help them get another job, or in this case, what I'm arguing here is that a very big part of the solution is making sure that the skill set that the workforce of tomorrow has is a skill set that everybody has, not just the lucky few. If you don't have that, then there is a very real risk that with increasing automation, there is increasing inequality. My argument today is that's bad for our country because you have more people at the ends of the spectrum, and you have a weaker economy. All of the data that I've seen shows that if you can reduce inequality, you can increase economic growth. About half of GDP comes from household spending. So if you can boost that, you can boost economic growth. So there are virtuous reasons for us to go down this path, and whilst it's not the only solution, education must be at the core of our thinking here.
And finally, just around the leadership question that's displayed, I mean, if you look at the Brexit example, people that notionally supported the idea of staying are now in charge of the House, and now they've got to put arguments there as to how they're going to sustain leaving. If we're talking about the Australian context, where do we see the leadership taking that debate here, and how should that be fostered more?
Well, I think we're in a better situation in the sense that both in the discussion about innovation, there is a lot more bipartisanship. You see the two leaders coming together. That wasn't the case 13, 14 months ago when Tony Abbott was Prime Minister. We were asking him questions about putting coding in the curriculum and getting laughed off in question time. Turnbull is a different beast. He understands it, and there's a real opportunity there, I think, for collaboration. It's the same in trade. We don't have the same problem that you find in the US, where you've got both candidates of both the major parties arguing as sort of an anti-trade agenda. I think Australia, from our place in the world where we sit, looking north, we understand we're a trading nation, that our future lies not just in being able to pull resources out of the ground, but the resources between our ears, and that if we are smart enough to take advantage of the rising middle class in Asia, then Australia will be a wealthier country and living standards will rise. So that explains why I think you've got both major parties closer to the centre of that economic debate, providing what I'd argue is a real level of leadership.
I think our audience and our CEDA membership would only wish that process of bipartisanship every success, and we recognise, I think, that Australia's economic future very much depends upon those that have been elected to government, and I use that in its broadest sense, men and women of goodwill that are looking to embrace policies that are going to drive the nation forward. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome the Shadow Minister for his contribution this morning. Thanks, Jason.